and political changes that are occurring in the 1800s in the Ottoman Empire, which is eventually going to be Turkey, China, and Japan. So the chapter kind of focuses on these pieces that now we're seeing. This is the context, right? What's happening? We see industrialization in Europe and in the Americas, which is modernization as well, and a lot of that technology and those ideas, they're kind of beginning to enter into these other regions in the East, right? And that's going to come into contact with traditional ways and beliefs. China and Japan are fairly isolated, and now they're going to be less isolated. And again, traditionalists or Confucianists are going to be concerned about that. So let's start with the Ottoman Empire real quick. It is in decline by the 1800s, and we talked about the Ottoman Empire was known for its toleration, and that's going to start to decline. As more foreigners or as more non-Muslims leave the Ottoman Empire, that's going to hurt the economy. And so that's, we're going to see a rise in ethnic nationalism and kind of, again, intolerance of other ethnic groups. There's going to be corruption in politics, and Europeans are going to see this opportunity to kind of take over in a sense, maybe not actually control the empire, but maybe, again, influence the empire from an economic standpoint. China, Europeans are going to start to influence China. They're going to start taking pieces of China as the central government of China weakens. And really, it's during this chapter we see the end of the Chinese dynasties. Japan recognizes the threat. They see how China is struggling, and Japan actually centralizes even more under an emperor. And they do adapt or adopt Western technology, but they still limit direct influence on Japan. So Japan really emerges as an empire or a power during this time. It's really a rapid transformation. So as the Chinese dynasties decline, as the Ottoman Empire declines, Japan becomes one of the larger empires in the region. They're competing with Russia. All right, so a little bit about the Ottoman Empire. Again, we've talked about it's one of the gunpowder empires, an Islamic empire, mostly a Sunni empire, right? And the ruler we're going to focus on today is Muhammad Ali, not the boxer, but one of the great emperors or the rulers of the Ottoman Empire. He was actually located in Egypt. So remember, Egypt was, the center of this empire during this period of time. 1801, and he's going to consolidate power. He's going to defeat the Mamluks. Remember the Mamluks? That would be Saladin. They were kind of an Islamic group that was focused or living in Egypt. And he's going to kind of basically, rule the empire from Egypt. He's going to conquer much of Arabia, including Mecca and Medina, those important Islamic cities, and Syria. And again, know your geography, right? This is the empire, fairly large, very similar to the Byzantine Empire. Some of the old, Islamic empires are put into this as well. So a large empire for the time, definitely. All right, so what are the reforms under Muhammad Ali? The first thing, he's going to transform the Egyptian army into more of a European model. Again, he's borrowing from European ideas. Maybe not technological ideas, but military ideas. He's going to start paying soldiers. We're not going to see, he's going to de-emphasize the Janissary. Remember the Janissaries? They were, former slaves, or they were, non-Muslims who were forced into the military. They were trained at young ages, and they became kind of an elite fighting force. But again, they were, forced into the military. What Muhammad Ali is going to do is he's going to pay soldiers. He's going to have a professional army. He's going to start drafting men, all men, not just non-Muslims. The feudal system is alive and well in this empire. Peasants are being taxed heavily. They will have to give up their land to the government. So it's a pretty oppressive regime when it comes to the lower classes. And the government is going to start to control cotton production and exports. It is known as a state-sponsored industry, and that's important to remember. It is a hands-on, non-laissez-faire system where the government is controlling industry. Now they are expanding industry, which is good, but we're not going to see private ownership in the Ottoman Empire. What are some of the industries that are going to grow? The government's going to build roads. They're going to subsidize railroads. They're going to create and run factories to produce military equipment. That's important. The Ottoman Empire will become a pretty major player in World War I. They're going to produce textiles, and these factories are going to produce ships for the Ottoman Navy. So not only do we see the industrialization of goods, we see the growing militarization, right? Weapons, armaments. All right, the next ruler we're going to focus on is Mahmud, 1808. He's going to continue the reforms of Muhammad Ali. He's going to continue to build roads. He's going to establish a postal service. He's going to abolish the feudal system, and he's going to try to improve the lives of peasants. He's going to continue to limit the power of the Janissaries. Remember, they were also soldiers, but they were also tax collectors. And basically, they were kind of skimming off the top quite a bit. Mahmud's going to end that practice, and he's going to make sure the central government conducts tax collection directly to limit that corruption. And he's going to install a European-style bureaucracy, similar to what you might see in England or in Germany, right? Where you're going to have the ruler and then you're going to have officials. So, probably not too different than what the governments were like in China during the dynasties as well. But again, notice the influence of Europe, that's the westernization from a political standpoint too. Abolishing the feudal system had already been done in Europe by this time, and Russia. All right, so what are some reforms that emerge after Mahmud? The Tanzimat reforms, 1839. And again, there's this continuation of change, right? So the sultans, who were the rulers, they began to codify laws. That's important. This is there were Sharia law as well, but they're going to create new laws that focus more on crimes and punishments and business laws, right? Going away from the Islamic Sharia laws that focused on ethical behavior and morals. The Ottoman Reform Edict created equality for all men. Again, it's going back to more of a tolerant society where it didn't matter what your religion was, your ethnicity, you were equal in the eyes of the government. They started to regulate the millets. Remember, those are those segregated communities. Again, trying to promote more toleration. But traditional Muslims, from that earlier Ottoman Empire, they were kind of concerned about that. They believed that there was too much westernization emerging. Too much toleration, perhaps. We're going to see secular schools. That's probably not going to make those traditional Muslims happy as well, right? Separate schools that weren't maybe governed or monitored by the government. Newspapers, too, are going to emerge, right, to obviously communicate news. You're going to see primary and secondary and colleges emerge. We had roads, but now we're going to see the innovation of canals and railroads. Again, this is happening after Muhammad Ali and after Mahmud, or after Mahmud. Also, this is an interesting cultural change that you might see on the test. Just to kind of, help soldiers, the military headgear changed from caps to the fez. You've probably seen that in some old movies, the fez. The idea was now the soldiers, when they would pray, as part of the 5 pillars of Islam, that they could actually touch their head to the ground during prayer. So that's a cultural change that is a reform. Again, I think that's a great example of a type of source you might see that just demonstrates these cultural changes during the late Ottoman Empire period. What are some changes economically? Trade's going to continue, right? Constantinople, or actually Istanbul, is still a major trade center. Cairo in Egypt. And the Americas are going to be more intertwined now because of improved travel, right? So I wouldn't say the Ottoman Empire was flourishing, but trade wasn't in decline. Banking was increasing. A lot of workers were being paid in cash. So maybe, more of a modern economy was emerging. In terms of women, still limits. They couldn't hold on to money. They couldn't have property rights. But one improvement would be in the form of education, right? So still a patriarchal system, no doubt. All right, as far as decline goes, the Ottoman Empire won't actually cease to exist until after World War II, but it was, again, declining, mostly because of, again, intervention influenced by Europe. For example, so the government of the Ottoman Empire actually allowed Germans to build a railroad, and they also opened up banks to invest in the Ottoman Empire. That was a problem, that you're opening the door to outside influences. Also, Europeans were granted extraterritoriality, and that might be on a test. It's actually given them protections. So, they could commit certain crimes and they would be legally protected. And the Ottoman people weren't thrilled with that. It was demeaning that the Europeans had these, extra rights or these, advantages. And then the idea of capitulation. This is the biggest problem, is that the sultans, to kind of bring business in and bring Europeans in to invest, they made a lot of concessions. They gave Europeans a lot of economic rights and privileges, a lot of favorable advantages when it came to trade and paying taxes. And over time, the Europeans kind of drained resources from the empire. And eventually, a lot of the wealth was in the hands of the Europeans, and it kind of, went over the head of the Ottoman people. And that, again, led to a lot of resentment. And also, now, on the other hand, though, the Christians that were living in the empire were protected, right? So that's a continuation of some, increased toleration, perhaps. But overall, you're going to see Europeans kind of start to dominate the economy, or really have a lot of influence and guide the economy in a direction that favored them. And as time would go on, you'd see fewer exports. And farming was in decline. So again, even though trade was apparent and it existed, it was again declining as we got into the 1900s. Because of that, there were scapegoats. So there were groups of Christians that were then targeted by the Muslim population. Armenians, for example, you'll learn about the Armenian genocide in the next unit. These were Christian minorities who, again, eventually would be massacred as time would go on in and around World War I. Then you had a group of Turks, young Turks they were called, and they were kind of concerned about European influence, but at the same time, they adopted a European-style constitution, but they were concerned about the outside influence, and they called for the Turkification of ethnic minorities, kind of assimilating them. Try to teach them and encourage them to be more traditional. And again, their overall goal was to limit European influence. Here's a cartoon showing the kind of the competing groups, the Young Turk, and then more of probably the older generation of Turkish sultans. And again, as time would go on, there'd be a lot of resentment toward other European nations, maybe not Germany, but France and England, and that would result in the Ottoman Empire aiding Germany during World War I, which was probably a mistake because Germany kind of lost the war, and the Ottoman Empire was then broken up. All right, China, the Qing dynasty. We kind of covered the Qing dynasty. That was a very tolerant dynasty. It was remember, outsiders called Manchurians were governing China, still maintaining Confucian principles, but they were outsiders. And they opened up trade a little bit. Foreigners could trade in the city of Canton, but only Canton. And remember, the Chinese were obsessed with silver, right? There was just a limited desire for European goods and a lot of distrust. There was an event where Lord Macartney, right over here, a British a governor who comes to China and wants to open China up more to Europe, and actually he showed a lot of disrespect by not kowtowing. You might remember the kowtow, the bow. So Chinese were very distrustful of the Europeans, but they acknowledged though that trade with Europe was beneficial. So there was a small opening. So really the one trade item that the British wanted to maintain and export into Europe was opium. If you don't know what opium is, it's a very deadly drug. And actually, it was grown in India and in the Ottoman Empire, and the British would actually grow it or buy it, and then export it to China. It was banned, but the government, the Qing, didn't enforce the laws. And as time would go on, addiction would be pretty widespread. And then by 1839, the government would get more restrictive, or they would restrict opium even more, and that led to seizures and bans by 1839. That leads to a very important war known as the Opium War. Definitely remember the Opium War. It's a turning point in Chinese history. So the British go to war to kind of protect the opium trade and open it up, and the British win pretty decisively over the Chinese, and a treaty is formed, the Treaty of Nanking. Again, I would remember this. Basically, it was a win-win for England. It opened up more ports in addition to Canton. It granted extraterritoriality for British citizens. And Hong Kong became a British colony. So, basically what you're seeing now is China's being carved up. The British didn't have a large colony there, but they had a lot of influence. And other Europeans are going to attempt to, again, have more influence there. And we call this the development of spheres of influence. And basically, Europeans are going to really spend more time there, try to influence the government, open up trade, not rule, not necessarily colonize, but have a lot of investment from an economic standpoint and political influence there, guiding the Chinese to become more westernized. Even from a military standpoint, European countries would have military boats that would travel into the interior. So there was a lot of military influence as well. But I wouldn't go so far as to say China was broken up into colonies like Africa was. After the Opium Wars, we have an effect. We have a series of events that kind of occur. The Taiping Rebellion. Definitely remember the Taiping Rebellion in that it was an effect of the Opium War. So people were upset with the Opium War loss. They believed that the Chinese had given up too much and nothing in return. So as a result of that, you're going to see this rejection of all foreign rulers or all foreign influences, but the Manchus, not Europeans, but the Manchus, right? Remember, the emperor was Manchurian. He was from Manchu. The Qing were Manchurian. Remember, the men had different hairstyles. So they were kind of now under attack. There was also resentment towards Christian missionaries who were denouncing ancestor veneration and foot binding. So there's this wave of rebellion. So there was starving peasants, workers, miners. They all kind of came together under this guy, Hong Zi-Quan, who himself was a Christian, actually, who thought he was the brother of Jesus. He actually creates a Christian kingdom, and then he ends up overthrowing, or he seeks a Christian kingdom, and he ends up overthrowing the Manchu Qing rulers. However, there was a counter-revolution where the Qing end up putting the rebellion down with the help of, no surprise, the French and British, who obviously want to maintain the gains that they made after the Opium Wars. Something that did help the counter-rebellion was internal, where there were Qing supporters who believed that Confucian beliefs were still important to uphold, and they believed that the rebellion went against those, right? This idea of respecting your ruler, respecting your elder, for example. So, a combination of sympathy or support for the Qing and also foreign help helped end the Taiping Rebellion. But it is evidence of growing frustrations in China regarding the government and their appeasement of foreign rule. The wars kind of had led to many deaths. So as a result of that, between 1861 and 1895, the leaders of China recognized that they needed to do something. So to compete with those foreign powers, they realized they needed to improve their military technology, their military readiness, and advance manufacturing, especially of armaments and ships. So it's basically they're industrializing, but with a focus on militarizing. They also recognize the need to create a stable government that could do a better job of collecting tax revenue and pay back debt. And that would really help trade. So that's just an example of this modernization, right? They're still going to centralize their government or maintain a centralized government, but they're going to try to reform it a little bit to make sure it's more effective. They're also going to improve tax collection on imports and exports just to increase revenue. But again, they're going to maintain Confucian principles, a strong bureaucracy. So that's going to continue on going forward. They're also going to hire American advisors, right? So they were resistant to foreign influence, but they recognized that they needed some help in kind of running those factories and shipyards. They also encouraged students to go abroad for education. So migration is an important theme here. You're going to have workers leaving, but mostly here you're going to have students going abroad. So, be able to provide examples of that migration, at least in China. All right, so there were some challenges to traditionalism. Again, we're going to see some political changes occurring right around the late 1800s, early 1900s. So China is defeated in a war with Japan. It was known as the Sino-Japanese War. That war kind of benefited Japan. Japan was able to take the island of Taiwan. So as a result of that, there were a lot of groups that were frustrated. They formed clubs, or I think what I would call political parties, that challenged some of the traditional ways. So the next step would be something known as the 100 Days of Reform, led by Kang Youwei. That's him right here. And he kind of decided that maybe the Chinese needed to abolish civil service exams and maybe introduce Western-style systems of government. This is, a major change. Again, it was an attempt because Empress Cixi kind of emerges and recognizes that there was this threat to tradition, and she goes against these reform efforts. So she's the emperor's adopted mother, and she ends up, in a coup d'etat, imprisoning the emperor, who was sympathetic to the reforms, and basically she was now the ruler. And again, we're talking the Qing dynasty still. And she, again, feared, growing foreign influence. So she's going to actually stop the extension of railroads and telegraphs. She's going to put she's going to put the brakes on a lot of these new Western reforms. She does recognize, though, as time goes on, that the civil service system is flawed, and she eventually bans it in 1905. She believed, or it was believed, that the wealthy were just using it to get favors. It was kind of marginalizing other groups. And as a result of a lot of the bribing, there was a lot of lost revenue. And there was cheating involved. Those non-qualifiers would cheat on the exam and would take posts. So they basically recognized that the civil service system was just ineffective. So that's a huge change politically in Chinese history. All right. In response to, again, the growing presence of foreigners, despite Cixi's attempts to curb it, there was a growing rebellion occurring known as the Boxer Rebellion. And the Boxers were also known as the Righteous and Harmonious Order of Fists. I think the Boxer term was given to them by the Europeans and Americans. And these Boxers were opposed to the presence of all foreigners. And as a result, kind of a golden age would emerge. And a violent campaign targeted missionaries and converts and anyone who was really from the West. And again, the reasoning was that Western culture was and Christianity was actually being blamed for the famine and those natural disasters. So, that plague, those floods really had a huge effect on these changes. An army made up of the British and the Americans used force to put down the rebellion. So the rebellion wasn't really successful. But again, it's a great example of the pressures that the Chinese were feeling and facing and how they responded to that growing Western influence. So I would definitely remember the Boxer Rebellion in that context. All right. Following the Boxer Rebellion, there was a war between the Russians and Japanese, and it actually had a lot to do with China, or it impacted China. So between 1904 and 1905, the Japanese and Russians went to war. The Russians actually, it was considered a draw, but the Russians did withdraw from Manchuria, which is northern China. And that opened up, kind of left a vacuum where the Japanese moved in. And that was really, it hurt, or it was, that limited or weakened Chinese influence. Now that the Japanese were pretty much right there in the northern part of China, that definitely, had a negative effect going forward on the Chinese. During World War II, the Japanese would pretty much, come into China and really, attack the Chinese, and some terrible atrocities were committed by the Japanese. So the real impact would be felt during World War II. All right, so again, a huge change around 1911 where the Qing dynasty is pretty much overthrown. It's the end of the Chinese dynasties. This is again a turning point. And the revolution was led in 1911 by Sun Yat-sen. That's Sun Yat-sen. Notice his westernization, right? The suit, the tie, and the Three People's Principles was established, and it was this belief that China should embrace democracy, nationalism, and something called livelihood. And basically, and not only that, but also expel foreign capitalism. He was not a Marxist, right? But there are some similarities to his principles and those of, say, Marx or Lenin. He did believe that the Chinese had to have, had to promote loyalty to the central government. I guess you could argue that's a little Confucius in a sense, but more about, more about, I think, nationalism, right? By the way, democracy would when he meant democracy, he didn't mean let the people vote per se, but that the people would have, more economic freedom with foreign capitalism out, basically out of China. That the people of China would have a greater say in their economy. So not traditional democracy where the people are voting and electing the leader. Again, nationalism would be having this intense loyalty to the central authority. And then from a livelihood standpoint, the idea of this is more socialist, right? The equal distribution of wealth. That was important. But eventually Sen would be pushed out by local warlords in 1913, but the republic would still remain. But there would be kind of a series of there'd be a lot of political chaos for a while until the emergence of a dictator in the 1950s. So the Chinese National Party, again, would rule until the 1950s. In the 1950s, communism would kind of take over in China, but up to that point, again, there was kind of really, I wouldn't say a lack of leadership, but there wasn't a really strong political entity that was governing, so there was still a lot of chaos. However, they were able to resist foreign domination until World War II, when Japan would kind of intervene. They would get a lot of protection from the United States in return for trade benefits after the Russian War with Japan. Teddy Roosevelt, in his Treaty of Portsmouth, was able to check and ensure that the Japanese would slow their expansion in China. So again, until World War II, the Chinese were fairly safe from expansion or imperialism, and the economy grew slowly. All right, emigration, another important theme here. A lot of movement of people from China, men especially, left their families and went to the United States to work on railroads. And that had an impact on women who had took on increased social and economic roles. And that's going to kind of undermine Confucian principles over time. Why? Why was there a lot of migration? One, there were just too many workers in China, not enough jobs. So there was the political turmoil when the republic was established, or when the Qing dynasty was kind of falling, and again the famine, the flooding, caused people to leave. Chinese workers went to the Caribbean to work on British sugar plantations. There was a huge shortage of labor outside of Asia, so there were some jobs available. In Mexico, Australia, the United States, they worked on railroads and factories. They were actually indentured servants. That's an important piece to remember. They would have to pay off their transport, the fees, the costs involved in transportation, and then they would kind of be free to stay in those places. They would establish communities called enclaves, Chinatown in San Francisco, for example. But they did face a lot of discrimination and racism, especially in the United States, when the United States government passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 that basically said laborers couldn't come into the United States anymore. Not doctors or students, or professors, but laborers, right? The poor Chinese peasants who were fleeing China. And again, that's a great example of the discrimination that existed during this time with the Chinese. Remember the Manchu or the Qing kind of promoted this style of clothing, right? And that was kind of that disturbed Americans, the dress, the culture, the Manchu culture that emerged, and that kind of explained the changes that are going to occur after the Qing dynasty falls apart. And again, kind of rejecting that Manchu culture. All right, so let's talk about Japan. Just a few slides. Like China, they were going to try to be as isolated as possible from 1600 to 1854. So it's during that time there, even though Japan had an emperor, he really was limited in his abilities, and the shogunates, the military dictators, were in power. Remember, they were able to consolidate power from the daimyos, right? So they were kind of the centralized authority. They did persecute and remove Christians, right? They were doing whatever they could do to limit the spread of Western influence. There was some trade with China, but other than that, they were very, again, isolated. Okay, so let's focus on Japan. Japan was, like China, was fairly isolated. China was less isolated because there was trading in Canton. And remember the Chinese did see, had more of the Christian missionary work being done, but Japan was again probably more isolated. So remember, they were ruled by shogunates. So there was always an emperor, but he was pretty much powerless. And remember, the shogunates were able to consolidate power from the daimyos. Japan became more centralized during the 16 and 1700s. So these shogunates were military dictators. For the most part, again, they were kind of suspicious of Christianity. There was persecution and removal during this time. There was a little trade with China. China was probably the primary trading partner, but limited trade. But that's going to change in 1853 with this American who is Matthew Perry, the Commodore. He is going to be sent over to Japan by the United States government, and really he opens the door. Japan kind of yields to trade, after 1853. You wouldn't have a specific question about Matthew Perry, but perhaps it might be a document or an image of him, again, kind of opening this door with Japan. And that's going to be a huge turning point. That's going to lead to rapid modernization. But the Japanese are still going to maintain a lot of their social customs and traditional family structure. And that's important. Culturally and socially, they'll maintain old ways for the most part. But they're going to, again, the economy is going to definitely be the biggest piece that changes. So the shogunate actually, and the political change as well, the shogunate kind of begins to collapse. Basically, again, the emperor was more of a figurehead prior to the 1800s. But because of a lot of conflict the shogunates would have with foreigners and the daimyos, again, the daimyos were always kind of a problem, those land-owning nobles. Eventually, the emperor emerges and the shogunates kind of are pushed out. So again, by the mid-1800s, the emperor is now the political leader of Japan. Not necessarily political leader, but he is now making those decisions. At the local level, the daimyos or lords were also adopting military Western technology, and were able to kind of force the shoguns to resign, and again restore power to the emperor. So it kind of happened at the local level. Again, those daimyos kind of got that revenge, and were able to kind of, again, they worked together to get those shoguns out of power. So again, a very important change. That's going to open up the Meiji area. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. A very important piece. You probably might see this term on a test. 1868 to 1912. The first emperor who kind of now is in power, not just a figurehead, is Emperor Mutsuhito. Under his rule, feudalism is abolished. He reorganizes the Japanese government. There's a famous movie with Tom Cruise known as The Last Samurai. It focuses on this time period where the emperor is now in power. And, some traditional, the shogun is now in power, and even the samurai loses his strength and power. So what's going to happen is we're going to see small districts now under centralized control, under the rule of the emperor and the bureaucracy instead of the daimyos. So the daimyos do lose a little bit of power during this time. What are some of the reforms? Legal reforms, more equality before the law. the abolishment of cruel punishments, so some important legal reforms. A constitutional monarchy emerges where, yes, the emperor is in charge, but there is a constitution that he must abide by. The emperor is going to focus more on foreign policy, and underneath him would be the Diet. This political leader would focus more on domestic policy, the Diet. They would transform the military into more of a modern military with the help of the United States. Tom Cruise plays a Civil War captain who is sent to Japan or hired by the Japanese to train their soldiers in more Western military ways. We're going to see improved literacy rates. More of a Western education is going to be established. Japanese are going to probably travel overseas to learn, and the Japanese are going to build more railroads. They're still today known for the bullet trains and the advanced railroad networks that they have that really we need to probably model after today. So again, a great example of the growing industrialization. Remember, we saw this in the Ottoman Empire. We saw it in Japan for a little bit, and now we're seeing it in China, and now we're seeing it in Japan. So the Meiji era, very important time period. So the samurai were, remember, the traditional knight. They would protect the daimyo. This was the kind of the military of the Japanese for centuries. And they wanted to maintain a lot of the traditions, especially, the ponytail or the hair. They had a lot of political power. They wanted to maintain that political autonomy, but the new changes went against that. The centralization of the government, limiting the power of the nobles, the growing, more of a traditional military. So there were civil wars between the samurai and, again, the emperor. Eventually, the samurai were pretty much defeated and disappeared. From an economic standpoint, we're going to see state-sponsored industry. We saw that in the Ottoman Empire, where the government would subsidize and pay for and build industry, promote industry, increase taxes, tariffs, to increase revenue. So again, they're going to create jobs. They're going to pay for training, not only the lower level workers, but they're going to train managers to manage factories. They're going to promote the silk industry, the tea industry, shipbuilding industries. They're going to manufacture their own weapons. The government's going to build railroads and roads. So that's a great example of state-sponsored industry, especially the education part, right? Encouraging and paying for all levels of workers to kind of improve themselves. They're going to tax farms. We saw that, right, in the Ottoman Empire to support this modernization. Tokyo would emerge as the industrial center of Japan, also the center of government. However, private ownership was embraced. It wasn't a completely, socialist Marxist society. The government would eventually sell these industries to family-run companies known as the Zaibatsu. And a great famous Zaibatsu would be Toyota. If you've ever heard of Toyota, before it was a car company, was a loom work where they would manufacture silk. The Toyota loom work. So there's a good piece of evidence of the growing private ownership that was emerging. All right, from an imperialist standpoint, Japan was growing. We said that they entered into Manchuria. And they were able to imperialize or extend their boundaries because of the strong central government that was emerging. They had a large conscript or professional army. And again, there were those limits on the samurai that kind of allowed the Japanese to go outside their island. The government encouraged workers to leave, to find work in the Pacific region, Hawaii, for example. There was a growing population, so that would relieve population pressures. And also to gain knowledge of foreign places. So this wasn't a forced migration; it was seasonal migration. I think they saw the benefit of having their workers come back and train and teach other workers some of the new techniques or some of the new agricultural methods that they would see in the Americas, for example. But eventually the Japanese would seek their own colonies. They would seek colonies in Mexico, Latin America. They would eventually expand Japanese political power or into China. soldiers would be in Manchuria, for example. The Japanese would eventually enter into Korea and parts of Russia. Why? What was the motivation for imperialism? Mostly raw materials. It was for economic reasons. They could access those new materials like rubber, for example, oil. That was a big part of World War II. The United States kind of was trying to limit the ability of the Japanese to acquire natural resources, and that kind of pushed the Japanese towards war. Also, new markets, right, where they could sell Japanese industrial products. And eventually that's going to lead to more military intervention. We talked about the Sino-Japanese War, where the Chinese or the Japanese acquired Taiwan. We talked about the Russo-Japanese War, where the Japanese basically took over Manchuria. That's an important war. Mostly the Japanese were concerned about Russian influence in Manchuria, building a railroad. So they wanted to kind of acquire that territory, and they did. The Treaty of Portsmouth gave them control of Korea. Again, Roosevelt pretty much protected China in that treaty, but the Japanese obtained Korea. So there's a lot of Japanese influence in Korea today, and the Russo-Japanese War was really a symbol of the growing strength of Japan. So definitely be familiar with some of these. This is imperialism, right? Going to war to acquire land, and they did. What about women? We always want to touch on women. Increased education, but not for jobs, but to become better wives and mothers. Japanese women would begin to work out of the home in some of these textile factories. You might see images of women working in these silk factories, for example. Conditions were terrible, like in the Americas or like in Europe, so that's a continuation. But still a patriarchal society, definitely a patriarchal society. All right, that's it, guys.